Outlaw's widow begged a cowboy for shelter. Then he found the stolen gold under her bed when Thomas opened his door that stormy night. He thought he was saving a widow and her baby from the rain. He had no idea he was about to discover 3 bags of stolen gold hidden under his own bed, and that this desperate woman would either destroy his quiet life forever or give him the family he never knew he needed. The storm came down like God's own judgment that October night, turning the desert into a sheet of black water and wind. Thomas Wade sat by his cabin window, watching lightning tear holes in the sky, when he heard the knocking. It wasn't the sharp rap of someone seeking business. This was different, soft, desperate, like a bird beating against glass. He set down his coffee cup, the metal still warm in his hands, and listened. The knocking came again, weaker this time. Thomas had lived alone on this stretch of New Mexico territory for 3 years now. Long enough to know that visitors in the night usually brought trouble. Long enough to prefer his own company to that of most folks. But something in that sound made him rise from his chair, boots heavy on the wooden floor. When he opened the door, the rain drove into his face like cold needles. Through the darkness, he saw her, a woman in black, soaked to the bone, holding something close to her chest. Lightning flashed, and for a moment she stood there like a photograph burned into his memory. Young, maybe 25, with dark hair plastered to her pale face and eyes that held more fear than the storm itself. "Please," she said, and her voice was barely louder than the rain. "I have nowhere else to go." In her arms, wrapped in a wet blanket, was a baby. The child couldn't have been more than 6 months old, small and still, with tiny fists pressed against the woman's dress. Thomas saw the baby's lips blue with cold, and something inside his chest tightened like a rope pulled too tight. "Ma'am," he started, then stopped. The right thing would be to ask questions first. Ask her name, where she came from, why she was traveling alone in weather like this. The smart thing would be to send her to town, to people better equipped to help a woman and child. But the way she looked at him, like she was drowning and he was the only piece of driftwood in sight, reminded him of someone else. Someone from a long time ago. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. She stumbled past him into the warm cabin, water dripping from her dress onto his clean floor. Thomas closed the door against the storm and turned to study his unexpected guests. The woman stood in the center of his small room, shivering, looking around like she couldn't quite believe she was safe. His cabin wasn't much to look at. One room with a bed in the corner, a table by the window, a stone fireplace where orange flames danced and crackled. Clean, but simple, the way a man lived when he had no one to impress and nothing to prove. "Sit by the fire," Thomas said, pulling out the single chair. "You're both near froze." She moved like someone walking through deep water, slow and careful. When she sat down, she kept the baby pressed close to her body, protective as a she-wolf. The firelight caught her face, and Thomas saw what the darkness had hidden. A purple bruise along her left cheek, fading but still visible. "I'll get you something dry to wear," he said, moving toward an old trunk in the corner. He pulled out one of his shirts, clean cotton that would hang loose on her small frame, and something for the little one. When he turned back, she was staring at him with those dark eyes, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them. Thomas had asked himself the same thing from the moment he opened the door. He wasn't a man given to charity or kindness to strangers. The desert had taught him to be careful, to trust slowly, to keep his heart locked up tight. "Everyone needs shelter sometimes," he said finally. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. She nodded, accepting his words like they were enough. "My name is Sarah," she said. "Sarah Collins. And this is Emma." She looked down at the baby, and her voice went soft as morning mist. "She's all I have left in this world." Thomas handed her the shirt. "I'm Tomas Vade. You can change behind that curtain there." He pointed to a corner where an old blanket hung from a rope. "I'll heat some milk for the baby." While she changed, Thomas busied himself at the stove, warming cow's milk in a small pot. The storm continued to rage outside, wind howling around the cabin like something wild and hungry. But inside, The fire kept the cold at bay, and the sound of rain on the roof was almost peaceful. When Sarah emerged from behind the curtain, she looked younger somehow. His shirt hung to her knees, and she'd braided her damp hair over one shoulder. The baby was awake now, making small sounds that weren't quite crying. "She's hungry," Sarah said, settling back into the chair. Thomas poured the warm milk into a small cup, tested it against his wrist the way he remembered his mother doing long ago. This should help. He watched Sarah feed the baby, one careful drop at a time from a cloth dipped in milk. Emma's small mouth worked eagerly, and color began to return to her tiny face. The sight stirred something in Thomas that he'd thought was dead and buried. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked Sarah. She looked up from the baby. "I'm not sure. Yesterday, maybe, or the day before." Her words came out tired, like she'd been carrying them too long. Thomas moved to his small kitchen area and began putting together what food he had: bread, cheese, some leftover stew from supper. Simple fare, but enough to fill an empty stomach. He worked in silence, aware of Sarah watching him from her chair by the fire. "You don't have to," she started. "Yes, I do," Thomas said, not looking up from his work. "Woman and child show up at my door in a storm. Hungry and cold? Yes, I do." He brought her a plate and watched her eat with the careful hunger of someone who hadn't known where their next meal might come from. She ate slowly, making each bite last, and Thomas found himself wondering what had brought her to his door, what had put that bruise on her face and the fear in her eyes. But he didn't ask. Some stories came when they were ready, and some never came at all. He understood the weight of secrets, the way they could sit on a man's chest like stones. The storm began to quiet around midnight, the thunder moving off to the east like a herd of cattle. Sarah had dozed in the chair, the baby sleeping in her arms. Thomas watched them both, these strangers who had appeared in his carefully ordered life like characters from someone else's story. He thought about the spare blankets in his trunk, about making a bed on the floor for himself so that they could have his bed. He thought about morning and what questions the daylight might bring. Most of all, he thought about the look in Sarah's eyes when she'd asked why he was helping her. The truth was complicated, full of shadows and old wounds. The truth was that once, long ago, he'd needed shelter himself and found only locked doors and turnbacks. The truth was that kindness, once received, created a debt that could never be fully repaid, only passed along to the next person standing in the rain. Thomas rose quietly and added another log to the fire. The flames jumped higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm was dying, but inside his small cabin, something new was beginning, fragile as morning light, uncertain as tomorrow's weather. 5 days passed like water over smooth stones, each one quiet and careful as morning prayers. Sarah and baby Emma had settled into Thomas's cabin like they belonged there, though he could see the weight she carried in the way she moved, always looking over her shoulder, always listening for sounds that weren't there. Thomas found himself changing his routines without meaning to. He rose earlier to make coffee for 2 instead of 1. He brought in extra firewood without being asked. When he rode out to check his small herd of cattle, he found himself hurrying back, drawn by the soft sounds of life that now filled his empty spaces. Emma's baby laughter, Sarah's quiet humming as she mended his torn shirts with thread from her traveling bag. She worked constantly, those graceful hands never still. She cleaned his cabin until it shone, cooked meals that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in years, and tended to Emma with a gentleness that made his chest ache. But underneath her gratitude, Thomas sensed something else, a heaviness that seemed to press down on her shoulders like an invisible yoke. "You don't owe me anything," he told her one morning as she swept his already clean floor for the second time. Sarah paused, the broom handle tight in her grip. "I owe you everything," she said, not meeting his eyes. "You saved our lives. Storm would have passed whether I was here or not. That's not what I mean, and you know it." She looked at him then, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Most men would have turned us away. Most men wouldn't have." She gestured around the cabin, at the space he'd shared without question. You're a good man, Thomas Wade. The words sat heavy in the air between them. Thomas turned away, uncomfortable with praise he wasn't sure he deserved. Through the window, he watched clouds gather over the distant mountains, promising more rain. I'm going to town tomorrow, he said. Need supplies. You and Emma will be safe here. Sarah's face went pale as fresh snow. Town, Alamogordo. About half a day's ride. I'll be back before dark. She nodded quickly, but Thomas saw her hands tremble as she resumed sweeping. He wanted to ask what frightened her about a simple trip to town, but the question stuck in his throat like a bone. They'd fallen into a pattern of not asking, not telling, and it seemed safer that way. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Thomas saddled his horse, a steady bay mare named Rosie, and loaded his saddlebags with the few items he needed to trade. Sarah stood in the doorway holding Emma, and the sight of them framed by his cabin door stirred something in him that he didn't have words for. Lock the door behind me, he said. Don't open it for anyone. I won't. He rode away without looking back, but he could feel her watching until he disappeared over the first ridge. The trip to town took longer than expected. Old Martinez at the general store wanted to talk about weather and cattle prices, and the blacksmith needed extra time to fix a buckle on Thomas's harness. By the time he headed home, the sun was already sinking toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Full dark had settled over the land when he finally reached his cabin. Warm light glowed in the windows, and smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air. Home, he thought, then caught himself. When had he started thinking of it that way? Not just as his place, but as home. He unsaddled Rosie and put her in the small corral behind the cabin. As he lifted his supplies from the saddlebags, one of the flour sacks split open, spilling white powder across the ground. Thomas cursed under his breath and tried to gather what he could, but most of it was lost to the dirt. He'd need something to put the remaining flour in. Sarah had mentioned seeing some extra canvas bags in the storage space under his bed, remnants from when the cabin's previous owner had lived there. Thomas had never bothered to clean out that space completely. The cabin was quiet when he entered. Sarah had left a plate of food covered with a cloth on the table, and a note written in careful script. Gone to bed early. Emma wore me out today. Welcome home. Welcome home. The words hit him harder than they should have. Thomas ate his supper by lamplight, then remembered the flour still scattered outside. He lit a second lamp and knelt beside his bed, pushing aside the wooden crate he used as a nightstand. The space underneath was dark and dusty, filled with things the previous owner had left behind. Old newspapers, a broken harmonica, some tools that had seen better days. He reached deeper into the shadows, searching for canvas or burlap, anything that might hold flour. His fingers closed around something that felt like cloth, heavy and awkward. Thomas pulled it toward him, and in the lamplight saw that it wasn't canvas at all. It was a bag made of thick leather, tied shut with rope, heavy as a saddle and just as solid. Thomas set the lamp down and untied the rope with careful fingers. When he opened the bag, his world tilted sideways. Gold. More gold than he'd ever seen in one place. Coins and nuggets and small bars that caught the lamplight like captured pieces of the sun. His hands shook as he reached for another bag hidden deeper in the shadows, then another. 3 bags in total, each one heavy with wealth that could buy a dozen ranches or send man up for life. The floorboards creaked behind him. Thomas turned slowly, still kneeling beside the bed, one of the bags open in his hands. Sarah stood in the doorway to the small back room where she'd been sleeping with Emma. She wore his old shirt like a nightgown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. In the lamplight, she looked young and fragile as morning frost. They stared at each other across the small space of the cabin. Thomas saw the exact moment she realized what he'd found, saw her face crumble like old paper, saw hope die in her eyes and be replaced by something that looked like despair. "Sarah," he said quietly. She didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there in the doorway, like a woman facing her own execution. Emma stirred in the back room, making soft baby sounds, but neither of them looked away from each other. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions and unspoken truths. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the wind picking up outside, could hear everything except the words that needed to be said. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely louder than breath. "It's not what you think," she whispered. But Thomas could see in her eyes that it was exactly what he thought, and that the quiet life they'd built together over 5 careful days was about to shatter like glass dropped on stone. The gold glittered between them in the lamplight, beautiful and damning as original sin. The silence between them stretched like a rope pulled tight enough to snap. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale as candle wax, while Thomas remained kneeling beside the open bags of gold. The lamplight flickered across the coins, making shadows dance on the cabin walls like ghosts of better times. "Please," Sarah whispered, and the word came out broken. "Let me explain." Thomas set the leather bag down carefully, his hands steady despite the storm raging in his chest. He'd seen enough gold in his younger days to know what he was looking at. Not just wealth, but trouble. The kind of trouble that followed a man to his grave and beyond. "Go ahead," he said, his voice quiet as prayer. Sarah took a step into the room, then another, like she was walking through deep water. When she reached the chair by the fire, she sank into it, as if her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. Her hands twisted in her lap, fingers working against each other like they were trying to untie knots that couldn't be undone. "His name was Jake Collins," she began, her voice barely louder than the wind outside. "My husband. We were married 2 years ago in Santa Fe. I thought—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I thought he was a good man." Thomas rose from beside the bed but didn't move closer. Something in her posture told him she needed space to tell this story, needed to feel like she could run if the words got too heavy. "Jake worked for a freight company," Sarah continued. "Or that's what he told me. He'd be gone for weeks at a time, hauling goods between towns. He always came home with money, enough to keep us comfortable. I never asked where it came from. I should have, but I didn't." Her voice cracked on the last words. "What changed?" Thomas asked gently. Sarah's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. "Everything. 3 months ago, Jake came home different. Scared. He kept looking out the windows, jumping at every sound. That's when he told me the truth about what he'd been doing." She stood up suddenly, pacing to the window and back like a caged animal. Emma's soft crying drifted from the back room, but Sarah seemed not to hear it. "He wasn't hauling freight," she said. "He was robbing it. Him and 2 other men, they've been hitting supply wagons and stagecoaches for over a year. Banks too, when the opportunity came up. All that money I thought came from honest work." She gestured toward the gold with shaking hands. "Blood money. Every coin of it." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Where is he now?" "Dead." The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. "Shot down in Roswell 2 months ago. The sheriff there sent word that Jake Collins died trying to rob the First National Bank. Said he took 2 bullets to the chest and 1 to the head. Said he died like the outlaw he was." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking smaller than ever. "They also said he died alone. His partners had already scattered to the wind, and nobody knew about me or Emma. I was grateful for that at first. Grateful to be forgotten. But," Thomas prompted, "but the guilt came anyway." Sarah's voice broke completely now, tears streaming down her face. "I kept thinking about all the people Jake hurt. All the families left with nothing because of what he did. And here I was, living off their suffering, feeding my baby with money stolen from other babies' mouths." She collapsed back into the chair, sobbing now with the force of a summer storm. Thomas wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but he stayed where he was. Some pain had to be felt fully before it could heal. "I waited for them to come for me," Sarah continued through her tears. "The law, bounty hunters, someone. I packed our things and waited. But nobody came. Days turned to weeks, and still nobody came. I realized they didn't know about us, didn't know Jake had a family. We were invisible, So you ran? Thomas said. I tried to. I took what I could carry and left the gold behind, but she gestured helplessly. Where was I supposed to go? I had no money of my own, no family, no friends who weren't connected to Jake somehow. And Emma needed food, needed medicine, needed things I couldn't provide. Thomas began to understand. You went back for the gold. I told myself it was just temporary. Just enough to get by until I could figure out what to do. But every time I spent any of it, I felt sick. Like I was stealing all over again. She looked up at him with eyes red from crying. That's why I've been traveling so slowly, why I've been avoiding towns. I keep trying to find the courage to do the right thing, but I don't know what that is anymore. The cabin fell quiet except for the crackling of the fire and Emma's soft sound from the back room. Thomas stared at the gold bags, thinking about the woman who'd appeared at his door in the storm. The fear in her eyes hadn't been about the weather at all. You're not your husband, he said finally. Sarah looked up, startled. What? You heard me. You're not responsible for what Jake Collins did. You didn't rob anyone, didn't hurt anyone. You were just trying to survive. But I kept the money. You kept what you thought was yours, Thomas interrupted. When you found out different, it ate you alive. That's not the action of a criminal, Sarah. That's the action of someone with a conscience. He moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. The night was clear now, peaceful as Sunday morning, but Thomas could still feel the storm inside his chest. You want to know why I live out here alone? He asked without turning around. Why I've got nobody and nothing except this little patch of desert. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You don't have to. 5 years ago, I was running guns to Apache raiders, Thomas said, the words coming out flat and hard. Not because I believed in their cause or hated the cavalry. Because the money was good, and I was young and stupid enough to think that was all that mattered. He turned back to face her, and Sarah saw something raw and painful in his expression. One of those guns I sold was used to kill a family of settlers near Tucson. Man, woman, 2 little children. When I heard about it, I tried to tell myself it wasn't my fault. Tried to say I was just a middleman, that someone else would have sold them weapons if I hadn't. But late at night, when the world got quiet, I knew better. Sarah was staring at him now, her tears forgotten. What did you do? I stopped running guns. Took what money I had left and bought this place as far from civilization as I could get. Told myself I was done hurting people, even by accident. But the truth is, I was just hiding for what I'd done. Running away from the guilt instead of trying to make it right. Thomas sat down across from her, his hands clasped between his knees. That's the difference between you and me, Sarah. You're carrying guilt that isn't yours. I'm carrying guilt that is. They looked at each other across the small space of the cabin. 2 people who'd found their way to the same lonely place by different roads. The gold sat between them like a challenge, like a test of who they wanted to be going forward. So what do we do now? Sarah asked quietly. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds outside. Owl calls and wind through sage, the peaceful sounds of a world at rest. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady as stone. We do what we should have done from the beginning, he said. We make it right. Dawn came soft and gray over the desert, painting the world in shades of hope and possibility. Thomas woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Sarah singing quietly to Emma. He'd slept on the floor beside his bed, close enough to the gold to guard it, far enough from Sarah to give them both space to think. During the long night, he'd made his decision. Now, in the gentle morning light, he could see that Sarah had made hers too. She moved around the cabin with purpose instead of fear, her shoulders straighter than they'd been since she arrived. I want to take it back, she said when she saw him watching. All of it. To whoever it belongs to. Thomas nodded, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd made. You know, it won't be easy. Questions will be asked. People will want to know how you came by it. I know. Sarah sat down across from him, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. I've been thinking about it all night. The truth is the only thing that might set me free from this weight I've been carrying. And if they don't believe you? If they think you were part of Jake's gang? Sarah's smile was sad but determined. Then at least I'll have done the right thing. At least Emma will grow up knowing her mother tried to make things right, even if she failed. Thomas studied her face in the morning light. The fear was still there, but it was different now. Not the wild panic of a trapped animal, but the clean fear of someone about to do something hard and necessary. We'll need to find out which towns were hit, he said. Figure out where each robbery happened, so we can return the gold to the right places. Sarah looked up, surprised. You think I'm letting you ride into those towns alone with a baby and 3 bags of stolen gold? Thomas shook his head. Not likely, ma'am. If you're doing this, I'm going with you. Thomas, you don't understand what you're offering. This could ruin your life, too. People will ask questions about you, about why you're helping me. They might think, let them think whatever they want, Thomas said, and he meant it. I've been hiding from my mistakes for 5 years. Maybe it's time I stopped running. They spent the morning planning. Thomas had heard talk in town about various robberies over the past year. The bank in Roswell, where Jake had died, a freight wagon hit near Las Cruces, a stagecoach robbery outside Silver City. Each crime had left families hurt, businesses struggling, communities wounded. Sarah listened to each account with growing resolve. We'll visit them all, she said. However long it takes, however many miles we have to travel. Every coin that can be returned will be. They loaded the wagon with supplies for a long journey. Thomas hitched up his 2 best horses, steady animals that could handle rough roads and uncertain weather. The gold bags went into a hidden compartment he built beneath the wagon bed, covered with blankets and everyday supplies. As they prepared to leave, Thomas took one last look around his cabin. It had been his refuge for 3 years, his hiding place from a world that asked too many questions. Now it felt different, not like a prison anymore, but like a cocoon he was finally ready to leave behind. Having second thoughts, Sarah asked, watching him. No, Thomas said, and realized it was true. Just saying goodbye. Their first stop was Silver City, 2 days hard travel through desert and mountain passes. The town sat in a valley surrounded by mining claims and cattle ranches, busy with the kind of commerce that made it a target for men like Jake Collins. Thomas drove the wagon straight to the sheriff's office, Sarah beside him with Emma in her arms. They'd practiced what to say during the long miles, but when the moment came, Sarah's voice was strong and clear. My name is Sarah Collins, she told Sheriff Martinez. My husband was Jake Collins, the outlaw who died in Roswell 2 months ago. I've come to return what he stole from your people. The sheriff was a weathered man with kind eyes and careful hands. He listened to their story without interruption, occasionally glancing at Thomas as if trying to place him in the narrative. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Why now? He asked finally. Why not keep it and disappear? Sarah looked down at Emma, then back at the sheriff. Because every time I looked at my daughter, I saw the children who went hungry because of what my husband took. I couldn't build her future on other people's stolen dreams. They spent hours with the sheriff and the bank president, going through records and identifying which gold had been taken in the local robberies. When they were done, nearly a third of Jake's stolen wealth had found its way back to its rightful owners. The journey continued for weeks. Las Cruces, where they returned gold to a freight company that had nearly gone bankrupt after repeated robberies. Mesilla, where a family wept with relief as they received back the savings they'd thought lost forever. Each stop brought its own challenges, its own questions, its own small miracles of redemption. In Roswell, they visited the bank where Jake had died. The manager, a thin man with spectacles, studied the gold they'd brought with wonder and suspicion. This represents nearly everything that was taken in the robberies attributed to your husband's gang, he said. How do we know you weren't part of it? Thomas spoke up before Sarah could answer. Because if she was part of it, she'd be in Mexico by now, not sitting in your office trying to make things right. The man looked between them, then at baby Emma sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. I suppose that's true enough. By the time they'd visited every town on their list, autumn was settling over New Mexico territory like a gentle blanket. The gold was gone, returned to banks and businesses and families who'd given up hope of ever seeing it again. In its place, Thomas and Sarah had something they'd never expected to find: peace. They were camped beside a stream outside Alamogordo, their last stop, when Sarah finally broke down. Not with the desperate tears of fear and shame she'd carried for months, but with the clean tears of someone whose burden had finally been lifted. "I keep waiting to feel guilty about giving it away," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But all I feel is light." Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Like you can breathe again." "Yes, like I can breathe again." Emma crawled between them in the firelight, babbling happily as she played with Thomas's hat. Watching her, Sarah smiled for the first time since Thomas had known her. Not the careful smile of someone trying to appear grateful, but the real smile of someone who'd found joy again. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas looked at the woman who'd appeared at his door in a storm and changed everything about his carefully ordered life. "I was thinking we might head back to my cabin. All of us together. If you'd like." "As what?" "Your house guest forever." Thomas felt his cheeks warm, but he met her eyes steadily. "As whatever you want to be. Family, if you'll have me. Emma needs a father, and I—" He paused, searching for words that had been locked away too long. "I need you both. More than I knew it was possible to need anything." Sarah reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her fingers were warm and sure, no longer trembling with fear or uncertainty. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Above them, stars wheeled across the desert sky like scattered coins of light. But unlike the gold they'd spent weeks returning, these belonged to everyone and no free as forgiveness, bright as new beginnings. Sometimes the longest road home leads through another person's heart, Thomas thought, and sometimes that heart is big enough to hold everything you've lost and everything you hope to find.